him.
With who? Yeah, when we're done. We're going to tell some, after he finishes the first half, we'll do questions like we always do.
He's going to do the first half.
Yeah, right here.
Okay. 'Cause they want
Right
me to
here.
move this.
Well, I'll move it. I'm good at this. Good evening. It's wonderful to see you. I wish you a warm December. I turned on the heat. We'll see if it comes on. If it doesn't, we're going to have to cuddle with each other. Not so bad either, you know? But I hope that everybody is well. It's good to see you. This is Valley Beth Shalom's College of Jewish Studies, where we offer university-level learning without the football team, without the sororities, and no quizzes or tests. You can't do better than that. Tonight, we continue our conversation on the great debates that have shaped Jewish life. Last week, we did the debate between Menelaus and Mattathias, the great debate that it's the heart of Hanukkah. Hanukkah begins on Sunday night, first candle on Sunday night. On Monday night, if you'd like to come here, we're going to have a community candle lighting. I think it's at 5:30. I think it's on. And you bring a menorah, bring a kid, bring a dreidel. We'll have a little fun together. And next week, we're all going to light Hanukkah candles. Tonight, we're going to welcome our wonderful guests, but let me just give you a preview of coming attractions. We're going to take a winter break after tonight, and we're going to come back on January the 8th. Is that right? Is that Wednesday night? January the 8th, we're going to do a preview of medieval and modern Judaism, the great debates, and we're going to talk about what it means to embrace Jewish truth. That's going to be January 8th. And then our conversations through January and February will include topics about mysticism and rationalism, philosophy, the beginnings of Zionism. We're going to talk about the great philosophers of American Judaism, talk about Abraham Heschel and Mordechai Kaplan. And then the last week in February, that night, Rabbi Farkas and I are going to take up the most critical debate in all of Jewish life: which is more authentic, Hamantash or latkes? And I'll ask you to vote. We're going to have to vote that night. I hope you vote properly. So, the great debates that have shaped Judaism, we continue on Wednesday nights beginning January 8th through the end of February. Shabbos morning, of course, every Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, we have Torah study. And in January, many, many more events coming. So I hope that you'll come and join us for all of those wonderful events. I want to wish you all a very, very happy and sweet and warm Hanukkah. Can I ask you please to rise from your seats, turn to the folks beside you and say, "Damn glad you're here. Good evening. Nice to see you." Now, before you sit down, put your arms around a good-smelling Jew from Tarzana and bring him close. Because when we learn as a community, and so we offer prayers. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Ya'aseh shalom, ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yahaseh shalom, Yahaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yahaseh shalom, Yahaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yahaseh shalom, Yahaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yahaseh shalom, Yahaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. Please be seated. I have to confess to you that for a rabbi, I love Christmas entirely too much. I love the lights. I love the spirit. I like going to the mall and watching crazy people shop. And the thing I love the most is the music. I sing all the songs. I learned them all when I was in grade school because I went to a public school and they forced us to learn all the words. So even though my Christian friends don't know the words, I know the words, right? And I sing all the songs. And the problem is that when I sing Christmas songs, they all come out sounding Hasidic, right? Yai, dai, 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 ya, ba, ba, bye, bye. Doesn't that sound Hasidic, right? Cantor Fox and I, we're going to put out an album, Hasidic Christmas carols, the ideal gift for families of mixed heritage. Don't you think that's a possibility? I'm going to fund my retirement with this. But the serious part of this, is that there was a moment in our history when two great religious communities had to make a choice, and they chose to separate. The two communities chose to separate. And how that happened, why that happened, what were the forces that forced that separation, and what ultimately separates us, that's the great debate that we're going to talk about tonight. The question of how Jews and Christians became separate faiths. Now, I have a really sort of perverse imagination, because I had to go find someone to teach this, and I thought, who better teach this than an Orthodox rabbi, right? So tonight we have a wonderful guest, new friend of mine. This is Rabbi Ari Schwartzberg. Rabbi Schwartzberg was raised in Highland Park, New Jersey. This is a lovely suburb of Newark, right, where all great Jews come from. He's a graduate of Hesder Yeshiva in Israel, where he studied with Israeli soldiers. He's a graduate and received his smicha at Yeshiva University. He's also went to study for several years at Harvard Divinity School, where he learned this stuff about Christianity. And today he's the Dean of Students at the Shalhevet High School, teaches as well at Pepperdine University and for the Academy of Jewish Religion, the AJR here in Los Angeles. He's a wonderful star in the Orthodox, modern Orthodox world, and a wonderful, wonderful teacher and a dear new friend. Please welcome Rabbi Ari Schwartzberg. Here's how we do this. You teach for an hour. Somewhere around 8 o'clock, we take a break for some coffee and cookies. Then we come back and teach some more, okay?
Perfect.
You got to talk right into the mic or they'll yell at you.
I like to be yelled at.
Yes, you're going to get yelled at. They're good
Okay,
at that.
and is this like if people have questions now, they're allowed to? Oh, so I have to. So you just you sit and you're this attentive for this long? Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm not used to teaching like that. I'm not a lecturer. I'm used to sitting around the room with 25 students. But okay, we'll see, and hopefully people won't be snoozing. Okay, firstly, it is so exciting to be here for many reasons. One of which is that Rabbi Feinstein just taught at Shalhevet as part of something that we do the other week, and I learned two things about him that I bet you know. When Rabbi Feinstein really likes a text, what adjective does he use before it? Come on, someone know this, because he said it a few times, and I love it. I want to start incorporating it. If he loves a text, nobody knows? Rabbi Feinstein, do you know what I'm talking about? Oh, no way. I love this. He said, this is a delicious text. You know, come on, now I'm a student of your rabbi. And secondly, I've actually been here one or two times before to talk to some Diller students, but there are so many people that I've met that live in the city that are incredible recipients and have such deep affection for this community and grew up in Valley Beth Shalom. Stacy Reznikoff, her family, her parents, the Spitzer family, the Gills, and I'm sure there are many others that speak so fondly about Rabbi Schulweiss and Rabbi Feinstein, and it's been amazing to befriend those families, and I've learned so much about this community and the shul, so it's an honor to be here, and Rabbi Feinstein, thank you for your very gracious words, but Rabbi Feinstein clearly has just established or continued something that is really incredible in this synagogue and in this community, and as I said when I introduced him 2 weeks ago, before last week, I had only heard him give a couple eulogies, unfortunately, and they were profound and they were incredible, and it was great to hear them, if you can say that. But it was really wonderful to start befriending Rabbi Feinstein, and it's an honor for me to be here. Let me tell you one thing about myself that hopefully is a little bit of an introduction into what we're going to talk about this evening. So as Rabbi Feinstein just said, I grew up kind of in this modern Orthodox world. I went to an all-boys high school until I was 18. Then I spent almost 3 years in Hesder Yeshiva and Yeshiva in Israel. And then I spent a lot of time in a place where the sun never shines, and that is Washington Heights, New York. I was there for a long time and received my rabbinic ordination there. And towards the end of my time there were a few things that just started to frustrate me or felt that I needed something else. One of which is that I went to work at a shul for the first time, and I realized that all my Talmud studies for the last 7 or 8 years really didn't translate too well into the congregation that I was working in. People wanted to hear something different than just reading a page of Gemara. And I found myself, as Rabbi Feinstein mentioned, I was fortunate enough to go to Harvard Divinity School. And for me, it was a critical moment in my life where it was the first time in my individual religious experience where I was the only one in the room that was wearing a yarmulke. And I certainly was the only person that was an observant Jew. And it was important for me to be, even though now it's not the case, to be in a Christian environment where I was an outsider. When I was learning from them, there were Jewish studies professors there, people that I studied with, people that I'm still connected with today. But the experience that I had as someone who grew up really in a pretty exclusive, I wouldn't call it insular, but an exclusive Jewish education, and then finding myself in this divinity school, was actually the way Harvard and a lot of these Ivies were founded, first as divinity schools. And to be someone who learned from them and learned to understand their theology, their text, the way that they live life, was a critical moment in my own experience as a member of society and certainly as a religious person. And I say that in a humble way because tonight I'm going to actually probably teach more Christian texts than Jewish texts. And I'm not a Christian, and I'm not an expert in these texts. I'm certainly not a scholar of early Christianity, but I know a little bit about it. And it's important, I think, that if someone is teaching the traditions of another faith, that we acknowledge, and we just state that from the outset, that I'm not a Christian. I'm representing these texts in the way that I learned them and I studied them, but I'm not representing them as a member of their tradition. And the same way that I would want someone who's teaching a Jewish text that's not Jewish to say that about our text. These are sacred texts for another faith, and I treat them as sacred texts. But we're also talking about them in a conversation about two rival religions, or certainly in their early stages as rival religions. And I want to put that out there so we all can acknowledge that. Okay. The story of Judaism and Christianity begins actually before there's anything known as Christianity, of course. And the story begins somewhere before the temple is destroyed in the year 70. And if we know anything about this era, we know that it was an era of tremendous discord for the Jewish community. Every community, and it's not so far off, although it's a little anachronistic to talk about denominational Judaism and fit it in with the 1st century CE, but you had different groups of Jews that are trying to figure out what is Judaism. What is this? All they had in front of them was the Bible, and then other texts that were written at that time, but there was nothing like we have today where there's kind of a received canon of a Mishnah, of a Talmud, of Rashi, of Maimonides. All these texts that we have that currently shape the way that we think about Judaism, that did not exist, certainly in any form close to what we have today. And you have at least 3 groups during these times. People called the Pharisees, people called the Sadducees, and then another group that were a little bit more radical called the Essenes. They're usually associated with an important work called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And everyone, or the leaders of these movements, are trying to figure out what is the right way to interpret what we would call the Torah, the Hebrew Bible. You can't live, if you open up the Torah, you can't live with just the Torah. It has to be interpreted, it has to be understood. So the Pharisees were affixed, were connected with what we call the oral Torah, or traditional interpretation. The Sadducees are associated with, as much as possible, a literal interpretation of the Torah. And the Essenes, they were a little bit more hardcore. They had kind of their own interpretation. Maybe we'll touch upon them a little bit later on. And then there's this person who becomes pretty popular, and his name is Jesus. And he starts saying some things around this time that start getting a little bit of attention. Some people like what he's saying, and other people really don't like what he's saying. But the story is very important to know that Jesus is part of this conversation, or is part of a group of Jewish thinkers and Jewish leaders that are trying to figure out what is Judaism, what is the truth of Judaism, and how, most importantly, do we interpret the Torah. And that is what I want to do for the first part of tonight. On the source material, it says parting of the ways, biblical interpretation. So how do we get to a point, it's hard for me not to move, how do we get to a point where there is what we call the parting of the ways? Whereas Rabbi Feinstein mentioned, we're these two groups of people, Jews, and then really, we begin with Jewish Christians, people who believe in the teachings of Christ. How do we get to a point where they part? And I think, and there's many ways to discuss this, but I think the first place that we have to look at is to recognize that these people are part of, at least at the beginning, the same community. They're hanging out with one another, and they're fighting over one another, maybe not in an actual Beit Midrash, but they're discussing with one another how to interpret the Torah, how to interpret the Bible. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, great. So let's actually read some text together to make sure that we don't just talk, but we see this inside. So I was struggling, which text do I want to share with you from the gospel literature and the New Testament? And what I want to start with is kind of a famous one in chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew. In fact, Rabbi Feinstein said initially we should talk about specifically Matthew and the rabbis, and he's right, because Matthew is where a lot of this is located, and we're going to touch a lot in the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew is, for a lot of people, they think this is the first gospel that is written, and it's usually dated somewhere around the time right after the destruction of the temple, 80 to 90 CE. And here, specifically in this gospel, as opposed to Mark, which we'll see, Jesus is portrayed very Jewishly. Very Jewishly. As opposed to later on, when we look at Mark, you'll see a little bit of a different stance for Jesus. Okay. Some of you may be familiar with this text already. We're going to take a look at it inside, and we're going to talk about it. Here it is written in the Gospel of Matthew, the words of Jesus. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I haven't come to get rid, to abrogate anything, the Torah or the Nevi'im. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. It's a little bit of a cryptic statement, but what's important to notice here is that in the words of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, he is not interested in abolishing anything, but he used this word, I'm here to fulfill them. I am here to show you this is what the intention of the Torah is. This is what it means to say, and in very careful language, especially compared with what we'll see later on in some of the works written by Paul, or the letters of Paul, Jesus says, I'm not here to abolish any of the law. And law is going to be, a lot of our discussion tonight is going to revolve around the law. So I want to give a few examples. I want to take a look on this. And I want to juxtapose some of the teachings, the early teachings of Jesus, with what we see, and once in a rabbinic text, another text in the Torah, and later on we're going to see this text on the bottom of the page in Matthew. And again, we're trying to figure out how did people interpret the Torah. So the first section that we're going to look at is from a section in Parshat Mishpatim, or interpreting something in Parshat Mishpatim in Exodus, which famously says that if something happens to someone, if someone gets hurt, how do you evaluate the way that person who causes the damage, how are they supposed to respond? Ayin tachat ayin, shein tachat shein. Ayin tachat ayin, what does that mean? An eye for an eye. Shein tachat shein, a tooth for a tooth. So how do we interpret that as Jews? Do we actually extract a tooth if someone damages your tooth? Do we actually extract an eye if someone damages your eye? No, what do we do as Jews? Money. So take a look. I'm sorry, I don't have the English translation here, but this is from the Mishnah in Bava Kama, one of the tractates dealing with the laws of damages. Anyone know when is the Mishnah written? Around what time? A little bit earlier than that. The Mishnah is usually attributed to around 200 CE, 200, 250 CE. That's when it is written. And it's really important. This to me is, if there's one thing to take away tonight, is recognize that the teachings of Jesus and the gospel literature is happening juxtaposed to the beginning of rabbinic literature after the temple is destroyed in 70. So we need to take a look at what is called the New Testament relative to the Mishnah and the Talmud. Oftentimes we look at these as two kind of biblical texts, and sometimes people just think, we take a look at the New Testament relative to the Hebrew Bible. Well, that's I don't know if anyone would do that here, but that would be really problematic because the Hebrew Bible precedes the New Testament by many, many, many years. And what we're really talking about is the New Testament and the gospel literature around the time that the rabbis are shaping Judaism after the destruction of the temple. So take a look at this. First you have on the right side in the Hebrew, I'll read and I will translate. Hachovel bechavero, if one damages their friend, chayav alav, they must pay this person, chamisha dvarim, You have to pay the person for 5 different things. If someone damages you, there are 5 things that you need to compensate them for. One is benezek, so for the actual injury. One is bitsa'ar, their pain. One is biripui, the healing that takes place. One is bishevet, the loss of their income. And the other one is boshet, is their loss of dignity, which is, by the way, very interesting. The way in which the Mishnah is so detailed that if you are damaged, there are 5 different layers that the person who damages you must account for, one including your pain and another including the loss of your dignity. That's a big deal. So the Mishnah asks, okay, how does this actually work? And the Mishnah says, benezek ketzad, how do we measure the damage? And this is what you said. Sima et eino, if you blind someone's eye, kata et yado, you cut off their hand, shiber et raglo, you break their leg, ro'ino toki ilu hu eved nimkar bishuk, vishamin kama haya yafeh vekama hu yafeh. What do? We take a look at this person and we say, hey, if this person was going to be sold in the market as a servant, how much would they be worth? And we measure that. What is the difference between what they would be worth before they were damaged and now that they are damaged? Okay, so we evaluate humans how they would be worth if they were sold in the market. That might not be so exciting, but that's the way we decide the value of a person. Now, this is a big deal on an interpretive lens because the Torah tells us ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye, or a tooth for a tooth. And what do the rabbis do? They interpret the Torah and they say, oh, that just means figuratively, not literally. So the rabbis are already making a significant interpretive pivot here in their interpretation, and the rabbis are always doing this. But recognize that the rabbis are interpreting the Torah as well. If you take a look at the Gospel of Matthew, also from chapter 5, here's what Jesus says. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Now, this is a classic Christian teaching about turning the other cheek. And oftentimes it is looked at with this is kind of the Christian value of interpersonal relationships, about being humble, not taking vengeance. But I want to suggest tonight that no, this is an interpretation of the middle of Exodus. And whereas the rabbis interpret this figuratively, maybe a little bit closer to the text, Jesus is having a conversation and interpreting the Torah, and he might go a step further, but Jesus is positioned within a conversation of other Jews on how to interpret the Torah. So he takes maybe one step further than what some of the rabbis are doing around his time, although the rabbis here are a little bit later than Jesus, but they're engaged in interpretive discussion of the Torah itself. So you can see at the beginning, Jesus is interpreting the Torah kind of one way, according to the values that he sees, and we'll see this in a second, even in a stronger position. And the rabbis are interpreting it their way, but they're part of an interpretive conversation of the Torah. Let's go down one to the next chart. And here, famously, many of you know, what does Christianity think about divorce? Anyone know? It's not a good idea. It's not a good idea. But the Torah tells us in Deuteronomy chapter 24, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him, the way that the Torah outlines divorce is something that our community is still dealing with because it seemed that it's outlined in a very unilateral way, but that is for another discussion perhaps. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house. This is chapter 24 of Deuteronomy. Take a look again on the left side of the chart. And the Gospel of Matthew says, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. That's what's quoted in the Torah. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Here, Jesus takes an extremely strict approach to fidelity and marriage, one that actually has resonance with that group of people that I told you, the Essenes, who lived kind of in the Dead Sea area, who were also did not like people being divorced. They thought that this was connected to the beginning of Genesis, where that a man and a woman should cling to one another and become as one flesh, that's the goal. And that's the way that God created us, or God wants us to be. So once a husband and a wife are married, they should not separate. So there's a tradition of this within the Jewish community, even though it was a fringe one. But now here you have the rabbis who write an entire tractate dedicated to how you should get divorced if you need to get divorced. And Jesus says, and he interprets this verse very closely. He doesn't dismiss it. What does the verse say? If a man finds something displeasing or something indecent about her, and he limits that, he reads that verse extremely closely, and says the only time you are allowed to get divorced if there is an issue of sexual immorality. So the rabbis do not limit divorce, and Jesus and his followers are limiting divorce. And this, of course, is something that still exists and had to be dealt with over the years in the Christian world. How are we going to allow divorce? And of course, this came up in England in a very famous case. But this is, again, an interpretive issue. Now, my favorite one of these is the last one on the page here, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12. Because here, if anyone studied a little bit Talmud in their life, they know that, like, what do Talmudic people like to do? It can't be this because of this, right? Sometimes what you call a kal v'chomer. If this, then this. And what I think I'll try to be able to show you, or what it speaks on its own, is that in the Gospel of Matthew, you see Jesus speaking to other Jews and using their interpretive methods to make his claim. He's not just saying, let's dismiss your methods of interpretation. He's using the same methods of interpretation, but arrives at alternative conclusions. Matthew chapter 12. So we're still in the world of Matthew. Firstly, it's a fascinating thing. People talk about this, that the Gospels are kind of unlike other ancient literature. They're really kind of these four biographical stories of Jesus' life. In the Torah, we don't have that, or in rabbinic literature, we don't have that at all. We only know the rabbis, aside for some snippets here and there. We know the rabbis because it says, Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, Amar Rabbi Akiva, and then it's stating what they said. And sometimes we have stories about what something that they're talking about. And in the Torah, we don't really get any biography about any of their characters. We have narratives of the Jewish people. But the gospel literature is, and it's very repetitive, is all kind of biographical information about Jesus' life, where his community or his students, his disciples, then extract ideas from those biographical descriptions. And people are surprised by this, trying to figure out who wrote the Gospels, when they were written, because they're really unique among other literature of its time. So let's take a look at the Gospel of Matthew and read this story. It's about Shabbos. It's about Shabbat law. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." Right? If you take a look at classic rabbinic literature, the traditional way of interpreting Sabbath law, you are not allowed to pick anything, any grain. You're not allowed to take anything off of a tree. That is violating one of what the rabbis call the 39 archetypes of work on the Sabbath. And throughout some of the Gospels, certainly in Matthew, the Pharisees and Jesus get in these arguments with one another, and they're trying to catch him and saying, "Look, you're not real. You can't be a Messiah. You can't be a legitimate voice because you're violating our tradition." He answered, we're on the third line now. He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry?" What's Jesus doing there? He's trying to take precedent from the Torah, from the Hebrew Bible. He's saying, you're challenging me on what I'm doing. I'm going to prove to you from your own text, from our text, that this is okay. He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Only the priests are allowed to eat the consecrated bread. But what did David do? The people were with him, the army that was with him, he fed them the sacred bread that is reserved only for the Kohanim, only for the priests. Or haven't you read the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? Oh, how do the Kohanim, how do the priests go ahead and do their service in the temple on the Sabbath? They're breaking classical rabbinic law, and yet they do that. I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. Now, here's Jesus' words of rebuke to this community. Something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and here he's quoting from the Torah, you would not have condemned the innocent. If you understood what law is really about, that it's about mercy, it's about values, you wouldn't be condemning the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. People discuss what this means, but he's saying that we are, or the Sabbath is made for us. Going on from that place, he went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Are you allowed to heal someone on the Sabbath? He said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? So he's saying, hey, what would you do if your animal fell into a pit and was going to die? What would you do? Of course you would take it out. How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? This is what we call, in rabbinic hermeneutics, a kal v'chomer. If you would do something there, if you would save a sheep, all the more so you would save a person. A person's life is valuable. Everyone knows that we violate Jewish law in order to save someone's life. So he says, if you're going to save an animal from being damaged on the Sabbath, of course I'm going to save a human being. Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. So section number 1 here. The parting of the ways between this early group of Jews and who become Christians, who become believers or followers in Jesus, is a struggle for the interpretation of the Torah. And there are several other examples of this. But people who begin, and this is in a sense the saddest part of this entire story, it's people who begin in the same community, who are having discussions with one another, figuring out at a time where the traditions of the Jewish people were obscure or difficult where there was no clear tradition. And they were discussing what is meant. And Jesus had his interpretation, and it was different. It might have been a little bit on the fringe, but he was part of the conversation. The story becomes more complicated as the years go on, and Gentiles or non-Jews become part of the mission of Jesus' disciples to spread his messianic ideas, to spread his voice. So that is point number 1. We're going to move into the second point now, and that is a little bit more of a theological discussion. One of the things that a lot of people talk about, the difference between Judaism and Christianity, is that Jews have an emphasis on mitzvot, on law, and Christians have an emphasis on faith. And that's the big difference between the two of us. In fact, some people think that, hey, what does it mean to be a good Jew? You don't have to believe in God. You just have to do the mitzvot. In fact, there's actually a discussion. Do we count faith as one of the 613 mitzvot? And I think you have such a thing as atheist Jews that still perform a lot of mitzvot. But there's no such thing in Christianity to be an atheist Christian. And the early discussion, and I would say some of the beginning, the antecedents of anti-Semitism within the Christian community become the way in which Jesus' disciples and the early Christian community start talking about our emphasis on law. Now, in the ancient world, certainly in the Greco-Roman world, people had at least two different conceptions of law. There were certain things that were discussed, divine law. What was divine law? It was rational law that made sense to you, that you didn't need someone to tell you what to do. These were the ways in which a person would naturally behave. These were universal principles. But law that a government or a person put on you, that wasn't considered divine law. That was law that was only necessary in order for society to function. And that was not held in high esteem. That was not considered virtuous. And the question became, and this question that I'm really interested And is law a virtuous thing? And I want you to think about that because I want to think about how you relate to law and whether you think that some of the points that we read about Jesus already and what we're going to see, like, is Jesus right? Was he right? Would he be convince you if he was speaking today about turning the other cheek, about being able to save or heal someone on the Sabbath? And the question became, to what extent is law virtuous? Today it's a question, to what extent is halakha something that is virtuous? Do we feel compelled by the letter of the law, or do we feel that the spirit and the values of Judaism supersede the values of halakha, the values of law? And now I'm going to turn to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7. Okay. One of the confusing issues for interpreters of the Gospels and people who want to understand this question is it's unclear if Jesus, and then later on, and especially Paul who's a disciple and the person who's responsible for spreading the message of Jesus, are they talking to a Jewish audience or are they talking to a non-Jewish, a Gentile audience? And it becomes very unclear, and scholars debate this, whether this idea, the abrogation of law, is something that is meant for the Jewish community that believes in Jesus, or it's just those who are the pagans, the Gentiles, that Paul wants to convert and bring them into this faith. Initially, many scholars thought that there was the idea of Paul, the idea of Jesus, the way that his followers interpreted him, was that nobody should be following the law. Law should be completely abrogated. Now many scholars have a more subtle position and believe that the Jewish community, it was okay for us to continue keeping kosher, for us to continue observing Brit Milah and circumcision, but that the Gentiles do not need to engage in the observance of law, that the Gentile community just needed to be saved by believing in Jesus, and we're going to get into that a little bit. I can't speak too much about the difference between Jews and Gentiles there. It's not an expertise of mine. And either way, Christian tradition, after this, has interpreted the law, I think, in a very negative way. So I want to take a look at this because I think this becomes very critical for the parting of ways, the separation between Judaism and Christianity, the hostility, the language that is used, and we'll see how it builds in the way in which the early believers in Jesus thought about the law. We'll start in, I think, a more compelling idea in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7. Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, he's calling a crowd, listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Still strange. It's always been strange anytime I have to teach something about Christian to be standing in a place where there's an Aron Kodesh, and now I'm actually speaking, and like as if I'm Jesus, and kind of saying to you with my arms raised, like, listen, everyone, and it's strange. The first time around my rabbinic ordination, so Yeshiva University did this thing where people who were getting ordained would speak in the kind of synagogues that they grew up in, and I was in the middle of divinity school when they had what is called the Chag HaSmicha, the celebration of rabbinic ordination. So I was, I was a little rebellious, and I thought, I'm in the middle of learning about early Christianity, so I'm going to go to my synagogue. And I happened to grow up my father was the rabbi of our shul, and at that point he just left. He moved on to a different position, but we still had a lovely relationship with the shul, with the synagogue, and I was teaching there. And I was young, and I was excited about learning some of this material, and I went there, and I started teaching in an Orthodox synagogue in the middle of Shabbos services, or right afterwards, and I started talking about Jesus, and I started teaching the New Testament. And I'm a 25-year-old at the time, or 24, whatever it was. And I was so into this, but I think most of the people that were there were just like, what? Like, my dad was the rabbi there for 20 years, and the word Jesus probably never came out of his mouth. And here it is, his son, the first time standing at the lectern, at the podium, speaking in the middle of Shabbos morning, when everyone just wants to get to Kiddush. And I'm talking about, like, the rabbinic and church fathers, their polemics against one another. And still my mother doesn't like when I speak about this. I told her the other night, I'm going to speak in Valley Beth Shalom, a wonderful shul in Los Angeles. And she's like, oh, what are you talking about? Well, they're doing a great debate series on Judaism and Christianity. She says, of course, that's what you're speaking about. And she just wants me to be doing, to be teaching Gemara, something a little bit more traditional. So Mom, I apologize. But I think I think it's really important for us to understand this. But anytime I have this, I do. It's a funny thing to be teaching this and then standing in front of an Aron Kodesh and then raising my hands as I'm, kind of trying to impersonate Jesus. What do they say? Everyone has a Jesus complex or something? So tonight is the night when I get to fulfill mine. Okay. Although, it's an amazing thing, and I really want people to think about this, and maybe we would address this later on, is this idea, like, how convincing is this argument that's going to be articulated here about kind of the spirit versus the letter of the law? And it's going to get really even more intense when we see the Midrash on the bottom of this page. So again, Jesus called to the crowd to him and said, listen to me, everyone, and understand this. And you see, this is a real moment, or the way it's written, this is a real important moment, where you probably have his followers struggling with, wow, you're a really compelling person, and I believe in you, but I also grew up this way. How am I to understand this? And they're at a crossroads because he doesn't yet have a community of followers. This is before there was anything like a crucifixion or a resurrection, and trying to understand, like, what do you stand for? Who are you? I'm really intrigued by this, and maybe I'm not as intrigued by what the Pharisees are saying, or I'm also open to being convinced. But you seem a little bit radical. You seem a little bit different. Make your case. And here to me always seems like a moment where Jesus is making his case. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. He's talking about the laws of tum'ah and tahara, of what makes someone pure or impure. Pure and impure, by the way, is not good and bad. It's a status, whether you're allowed to go into the temple. I think sometimes we make a mistake when we talk about this, that impure is bad and pure is good. It's not the case. These are halachic categories that affect the way the one can engage with sacred spaces, okay? And some of them happen in a very natural and organic way that we want to happen, like going to a graveyard or being involved in sexual activity. But Jesus is making the claim that a person's status or what can defile a person is not affected by what goes into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. He's talking about character. He's talking about who you are. What makes someone a defiled person? Or what makes someone maybe a sacred person, a person of Kedusha? Again, when we read all these texts in a translation, and that takes away a little bit from the language, our insider language, but you could imagine him speaking Aramaic at the time, and speaking like a Jew, like someone who's having a conversation about things that we would have a conversation about. This seems like a relevant conversation that someone could have today as well. After he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about a parable. And he scolds them, and he says, "Are you so dull? Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. What he might do here, what many people think, is he told people that kosher doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what goes into your body, but it matters what comes out of your body, how you speak, how you act, not what you eat. Now, many people think, and they think the reason why Jesus had a lot of followers is because this idea seemed to have resonance, and Rabbi Feinstein mentioned this when he spoke at Shalhevet the other week, resonance with classical tropes within the prophetic literature that we read on Yom Kippur and many other Shabbatot throughout the year, where the prophets, the Nevi'im, part of our canonized text, where they scold the people for being obsessed with fast days and sacrifices at the expense of their morals and their values. You can make a very straight line, and I could have put this on the source sheet, between what Jesus says here and some of the words of classical prophets. And perhaps that's what he's doing. He went on. What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person. I just want to move quickly to the next source because I want to just put them in context with one another, because kosher and circumcision are big ones. In Galatians, which is not a gospel text, but is a letter of Paul, he writes the following: "You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. Your obsession with the law your commitment to the law, this tradition of your people, have taken away, or you have fallen away from grace. For through the Spirit we eagerly await by faith the righteousness for which we hope. For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. So in these two texts, strong argument has been made, certainly for the Christian tradition, that the idea of kashrut and circumcision, likely the most defining markers of any religious community, but certainly the Jewish community, were abrogated or were expelled in the words of Jesus, or put into Jesus' mouth, or in this text, in the mouth of Paul. That you don't need to be circumcised in order to be a Jew or to be part of this faith community. You don't need to have a Brit Milah, the sign that we talk about in Genesis between God and the Jewish people. And you don't need to eat certain foods. And this one is really, both of these are really strong, because here you're really taking something away from what is stated in the Torah. You don't need to eat this way in order to be part of our faith community. Now this is what a lot of people say, some scholars think that last line about declared all foods clean, that this is something that is added later on. I don't know enough about that, but it would make sense, because it is such a strong thing to be put in Jesus' words, that he would say that what matters, nothing matters what you eat, because that really is explicit in the Torah. We're forgetting about, I'm disregarding kind of rabbinic layers that are added to kosher. I'm talking about basic things that are in the Torah about what is kosher and what is not kosher. But here you have the beginning in these texts about the notion of spirit versus law, about law being something that takes you away from faith, from grace, the real point of religion. And what I want to show you now is where the law is stated in a derogatory way, becomes very negative, and really juxtaposed to the way the rabbis now start speaking to law. And I really want to speak to you honestly, and I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything, but I want you to think about where you see yourself in this second chart, the Epistle to the Romans versus the Sifra, the Midrash on the second side. And you're going to see a very hardcore response of the rabbis. And I don't know that they're talking directly to one another, but it seems to me that they're clearly in conversation with one another, even if not directly. Okay. So firstly, the Sifra is part of what we call Midrashic literature. Some of the most critical literature that shapes who we are as a people is the way in which the rabbis don't get involved in interpreting the legal parts of the Torah, but in a way that they shape how we think about Judaism. And you have the Midrash, and we've all, right, Rabbi Feinstein, your rabbis are quoting Midrash left and right on Shabbatot. You've studied them before. But this, again, is written somewhere between the time of the 2nd century and upwards to, let's say, the 6th or 7th century. Okay? And we're taking here a look at the Sifra, which is a Midrash on the 3rd book of the Torah, Leviticus. And you're going to see the way in which the rabbis respond to a very important question that the Midrash asks. So I'll begin with the top of the Midrash in the first chart, right under where it says Sifra in Acharei Mot, chapter 9, verse 13. And it's quoting, "I am God, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God." A verse that we're familiar with. We say it all the time. It's central, it's axiomatic to being a Jew, that we recognize that God took us out of Egypt. And the Midrash asks a very basic comment. Why mention the Exodus from Egypt in connection with the details of each commandment? Why don't the commandments stand on their own? Why do we need to mention that God is the one who took us out of Egypt in connection with many of our commandments? Okay, that's the question. The Sifra, actually, let's take a look at the left side first. I think it'll be better for us. Okay. Romans. We're seeing a few different Christian texts. Now we're going to take a look at Romans. Another letter to the people of Rome. As Paul goes in kind of the first mission of Christianity, He's speaking to people that live in the Roman Empire. He's speaking to Galatia. And here is something that is called the Epistle to the Romans. And here's the way in these two columns how he talks about law. But now we are released from the law. With Christ's death, with the death of Jesus, having died to that which held us captive. Law puts us in captivity. Law is slavery. So that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. The old way, captivity, that is law. Law is constraining. Law is captivity. Law is not something that is spirit. Go to the next section. Do not offer any part of yourself to sin as an instrument of wickedness, but rather offer yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life. Offer yourself to God and offer every part of yourself to him as an instrument of righteousness. For sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under the law, but under grace. Now, I've really never understood what this means to be under grace. What I do understand here is that law was intended as some form of a pedagogue, something that helps us on our way of becoming who we're supposed to be. So law is confining, law is something that we need, but law is something that doesn't allow us to be our independent selves. It's something that children need. Children need law in order to get them into a state of adolescence. But living your whole life under law, that is not a freeing existence. That's not an existence of spirit. And with the death of Jesus, we are now free from law, and we can embrace the Spirit. The rabbis feel very, very differently. Take a look at the right side here. And now we're going to answer their question. Why do we mention the exodus of Egypt in connection with each commandment? So the rabbis give the following parable. To what can the matter be compared? To a king whose friend's son was taken captive. When he redeemed him not as a free man, but as a slave, so that if the king should make a decree and he did not accept it, the king could say, "You are my slave." What are the rabbis saying about our redemption from Egypt? Are we free people? No. We were redeemed by God to be servants of God. Ovdei Hashem, servants of God. The word slave is for me, has a much worse connotation than saying I'm an Eved Hashem, I'm a servant of God. But the rabbis here, whether or not the rabbis are responding to what the early Christian community is saying about law or not, I'm not convinced. I'm going to show you a couple passages where I think it's very clear. But here I don't know that they're responding directly to them. But it is clearly something that the rabbis have to grapple with. Why are we in servitude to God? Why are we engaged with law? Why are we engaged with halakha? And the rabbis don't try to get around it. They address it head on and say, what does it mean to be a Jew? Being a Jew is not to be free under the grace of God, but to be a Jew means that you are a servant of God. Let's go on to the next box. Similarly, when God redeemed the seed of Abraham, his friend, he did not redeem them as free men, but as slaves. When they went out into the desert, he began to issue a decrees for them, some light commandments and some heavier commandments, such as the Sabbath and the sexual prohibitions, fringes, and tefillin. Israel began to object. He said to them, "You are my slaves. For this reason I redeemed you, so that I can make decrees for you, and you will fulfill them." The theology of law that is stated by the rabbis here is one that says, no. Law is not about something for children in order to get them until they can kind of leave the house and do this on their own without the constraints of the home. But law is tied to our relationship with God. What is our relationship with God? Our relationship with God is one of servitude. Our relationship with God is that God is a master and we fulfill the way of God. And that's sometimes a tough thing for us to hear. It might be a midrash that some of us really like and say, yeah, that's actually what it is. That's what it means to be a religious person. You recognize that there's a higher power, and you say that my perspective, my understanding is limited, and therefore I follow his will. Or some of you might see this midrash, and you might say, wow, I kind of like that rationale on the other side a little bit more. And that spirit, the works of faith over the works of law, resonates a little bit more with me? And I think that's a question that we have to contend with, not as people who are going to become Christians, but at the way in which we think about law on our own. And this is something that the rabbis were thinking about themselves. Most blatantly, let me just take a look at our time for a second. Oh, we're there. Okay, I'm gonna skip to. Okay, wow. No, there's one thing that I feel like I need to share with you, which is like the part in the Haggadah. I'm so sorry. Okay. I'll take another 8 to 10 minutes then. But that this is the way the rabbis take a look at. Just to finish this off, and then we're going to skip the golden calf stuff, and we're just going to go to the Passover stuff. But the kind of most and really fascinating thing, something that I think you could talk about. We could talk about later on. You could talk about it like a Shabbat dinner or another time. Is the midrash on the back of this page, the one that says Sifra Kedoshim here? Does everyone see it? Just flipping the pages. They're stapled for you, right? The Sifra in Kedoshim. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, "From where do we know that a person should not say?" This is an amazing question. I love posing this to students in class. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. From where do we know that a person should not say, "I have no desire to wear clothes made of wool and linen," which is a biblical prohibition called shatnez, right? I don't know if everyone knows that. There's this thing in the Torah that says, hey, you can't wear wool and linen together. There are some Jews, I remember this was so wild to me, because even my family, a home of a rabbi, I don't know that we were obsessed with this one. But then I was once in a place, and they're like, today we have, I should be telling a story when our time is over, but someone says, today we have a shatnez checker coming into the building. And then I see like other people going, and they brought suits with them for this person to check about shatnez. And then I hear, if you buy a suit at Nordstrom in Bergen County, New Jersey, they actually have someone in the store that will check shatnez for you. What a world that we live in. So I don't know, shatnez. It's a biblical in the Bible. It's there. One of the things that if someone asked me what's the reason for it, I don't think that I could give them an explanation other than what we're about to see. And, so Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah wants to know, I have no desire to wear clothes made of wool and linen. A person should not say that. You shouldn't say, I have no desire to do this. I have no desire to eat the meat of pigs. Also a biblical prohibition. I have no desire to commit adultery. Yep, also a biblical prohibition. Rather, a person should say, I desire these things. Wow, I would really love, I get up in the morning and all I want to do is put on a nice jacket made of wool and linen, because, that would make me feel good. Or that I really want to eat treif. I really want to commit adultery. A person should say, I really want to do that. That is the approach you should have. But what can I do? God in heaven forbids it. Scripture states, I have set you apart. Your being set apart should be for my name. One should separate oneself from transgression and accept the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. The rabbis say something incredible here. It's wild. Law on its own. By the way, you know who disagrees with this midrash, and it's complicated? Maimonides. Maimonides doesn't like this idea. He has to get around it, like he has to get around a lot of his things, because it's something that's stated in the rabbis. It's almost like canonized in this midrash a little bit. But he's saying the actual idea of perfecting ourselves to a point where we don't want to commit these behaviors is not ideal. The position of a Jew, according to the midrash, is to be in submission to God. And how do we position ourselves in submission to God? We follow these laws. And that, to me, is part of the conversation with this emerging Jewish community that becomes the Christian community that sees this law as infantile, that sees this law as oppressive, that sees this law as something that is captive and does not see law as virtuous. And yet the rabbis are saying, no. The observance of law is extremely virtuous. This is the way that we express and show our relationship with God. That, to me, and I think that is the big issue between the emerging understanding of law, which to me is maybe the central issue in the parting of the ways between the early kind of Jewish Christian community and the rabbinic community. And that ultimately is what separates them, because what happens, just on a historical level, is that as Paul is successful, and he is a successful proselytizer, and the non-Jewish, the kind of pagan world, the Gentiles, join the fold of Jews who believe in Jesus as the Messiah, well, very quickly, the Jewish people who are part of this group stop observing their laws, stop keeping kosher, stop having circumcision, and slowly we have a separation between these two communities. It's a very important thing to know and very surprising that in rabbinic literature, vast rabbinic literature, Christianity and Jesus, they are addressed explicitly like no more than 10 to 20 times. That the Mishnah not at all, but that the Talmud and the Midrash ever address this, which is an interesting thing to think about. There's never an explicit acknowledgement of this emerging community. I sometimes like to think about it that, hey, there are flaws in my school, there are flaws in my family, there are flaws in our shul. But like, if I speak about them, it kind of draws a little bit more attention to it. I don't know if that's the healthiest way to deal with our problems, but what the rabbis do in classic kind of Jewish or rabbinic form is I think that they address these issues in much more subtle ways, where if you're reading between the lines, you understand, hey, this is what we're about, and we're not about what they're about. But the rabbis very, very few times address it head on and say, hey, these are them. Even when they refer to them, to Christians, or it seems like they're talking about them, they use this word minim, heretics, which could be referring to a bunch of people. It could be referring to Jews that they just think are outside of the boundaries. But it's very, very infrequent where in the Talmud or the Mishnah or the Midrash where Christianity is addressed directly. I need to show you this last one piece because it's going to change a part of your Passover observance forever, I think. The last page over here where there's this text of Dayenu on the top and Melito of Sardis. Okay, people here are familiar with Dayenu? Dayenu, right? We know Dayenu, yeah? Right, this is like one of our favorite parts of the Haggadah. But there's one question that bothers everyone that is asked at your Seder numerous times. It doesn't make any sense, right? Like if God took us out of Egypt, but didn't give us the Torah, that would be enough. I mean, the answer is clearly no. The answer is clearly no. If God gave us the Torah, but didn't bring us into the land of Israel or the temple, the answer would clearly be no. And people kind of try to give their own answers for this. Maybe it's just expressing gratitude. Oh, we're just trying to acknowledge every step of this process, which is wonderful and true and a great lesson in gratitude. But I think the answer to this is right here and is part of the conversation that we're having tonight. So there's a person named Melito of Sardis living in the 2nd century. And he's known, along with someone called Justin of Trypho, to be the real folks who hated the Jews, who really spoke negatively about the Jewish community that did not follow Jesus and did not believe in him. And the two things that I would tell you if you take these sources is to read the Christine Hayes piece that I skipped over, and you could take a look at one example of the Jewish text for the Golden Calf story and one example of the Church Fathers, and you'll see it very clearly on your own. But what did Melito do? And this is the way that the Christians or the Church Fathers interpreted the Torah, is that they continue to show that the Jewish people lost their covenant. Through our stubbornness, through our sins, God eventually said, to hell with you guys. You guys have lost it. You guys are old Israel. You've lost the covenant between God and Abraham, and now there's a new covenant, new Israel. These are the terms, New Testament, Old Testament. It's when I was my first paper that I wrote at divinity school, I had a Jewish professor, and I was thinking, I'm now in an academic institution. I can't say the Torah anymore. I have to say something else. And I wrote the Old Testament and in the paper, and he wrote back, in the first notes of the paper, he said, Rabbi, because he knew I was an ordained rabbi, he said, Rabbi, are you sure you want to be referring to the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, as the Old Testament? Old Testament is a polemical term. It's a term that says the Old Testament has been replaced by something new, and that's an important thing to know. When we refer to it as the Old Testament, that term is an intentional term that says, you are old, we are new. We are the new Israel. We are the New Testament, you are the Old Testament. So if we take one thing here, Hebrew Bible, if we don't want to say Torah, not Old Testament. So Melito of Sardis was trying to show that you, the Jewish people, look, this is who you are. And look at the left side of this column. Ungrateful Israel. Ungrateful Israel. Look what you've done. You got all these things from God, and yet you continue to sin, and you continue to reject God. And he lists all the gifts that we've been given from God. How much did you value the 10 plagues? How much did you value the nightly pillar and the daily cloud and the crossing of the Red Sea and the supply of water from a rock and the inheritance of the land? He accuses the Jewish people and says, you got all these things from God, and yet you continue to be a stubborn and a sinful nation. how could the Jewish people engage in the golden calf after God took you out of Egypt, performing all these miracles? How come the prophets have to continually rebuke each of you for your lack of morality, your lack of ethics, when God performed all these miracles for you? And you know what Dayenu is? It's a direct response to the claims of Melito of Sardis. And what's written is in parallel to each one of his polemics, his attacks on the Jewish people. We are writing to our people and saying, no. We are extremely grateful. And each part of Dayenu parallels a section of Melito of Sardis. And that is the origin story of Dayenu. It's responding to a Christian attack in the 2nd century. Even if Dayenu was written later on, it's that the Jewish people are inheriting this attack against the Jewish people and are now writing as part of the Haggadah, because Yetziat Mitzrayim, we are hanging on to our redemption, our deliverance, as opposed to the redemption that Jesus brings, or the deliverance of Jesus. And this night becomes one that we're saying, no, Yetziat Mitzrayim, this is who the real covenant is. Our covenant that is established with the Exodus of Egypt is who the Jewish people are, not another covenant or not another redemption story that happened years later with another person or another community that's claiming that they are the true redemption story. So the Haggadah in a few places has to make it very clear that our redemption story is the true redemption story. And it feels, or it is in response to some of the attacks or the discourse that is happening by this emerging Christian community. So I hope that we can flesh a few of these pieces out in a few more minutes. And I hope this is food for thought, because we're living in a time where it's really interesting that the Jewish community and the Christian community are not. Sorry. Yeah. We'll talk more about this afterwards. So get some drinks, and we'll talk more later. Yeah.
Very nice.
Okay.
So don't move yet, because I just want to summarize this, because I want to get this down, because it's too important. You'll get up, you'll eat, you'll drink, you'll forget about it. So what you've sketched for us, it seems to me, let's see if I got this right, is a 3 sort of stage process. So stage 1, you said, Jesus and the rabbi, Jesus and the Jewish community were not separated. They were both engaged in a common conversation about the meaning and truth of Torah. Jesus offering, in some ways, more radical interpretations of Torah. The rabbis offering either different or more practical interpretation of Torah. But they were together in one. Then you take one more step, you get to Paul. Paul was the great apostle, the great speaker of the truth, right? And Paul changes the name of the game. Because where Jesus was talking about the law, he was going to fulfill the law, Paul says, no more law. Something else has come to replace the law, namely grace, faith, a relationship with Christ. And the rabbis maintain, no, law is still necessary. Law is still the core of our faith. That's where you begin to crack. That's where the crack begins to really, the fissure begins to open up. Got that so far? Totally. So, third step is Melito of Sardis, and I really love this, because this is my Dayenu now. Yeah. This is great, right? Melito of Sardis represents what you call the church fathers, the early Christian teachers, who were ready to say, not only do you Jews miss the whole point by holding on to law instead of embracing grace, but you've been completely supplanted. You're not God's loved, favorite, chosen people anymore. You're sinners. We, the Christian community, we are God's chosen people now. You're left out. Your Bible is now the Old Testament, old truth. Ours is the new, the given truth. 3 steps, the communities separate, and you end up with 2 separate faith communities. Did I get that right? Did I get that right? All right, now the last thing. So we're gonna take a break. I promise you. You use the restroom, get a coffee. I just want to point out, Rabbi. I just want to go back to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, because I think any guy who says, "I wake up in the morning and I have 3 impossible to control desires. I desire to wear a woolen linen suit, to eat a bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwich, and to sleep with Charlize Theron, right? And you know what? I can give up Charlize and I can give up the bacon, but I can't give up the suit. Yeah, I got news for you. I've tried all three, and it's no contest. So take 5 minutes, get a coffee, get a cookie, come on back. We got lots of questions to ask the rabbi. Thank you.
There's a great joke.
Yeah, I know. Tried
joke?
them both. Right. Yeah, it beats ham, right?
Yeah, it beats ham, right? Yeah.
That's the joke. Thank you. That was great, Art. Yeah? Oh, that's the neatest music. Oh, beautiful. Thank you. Okay, good evening, everyone. If you please come and have a seat. Come and have a seat. Come and have a seat. It's great to see you. You might notice, by the way, that we changed the exhibit in the hallway. We change the exhibits about every 3 months or so. This exhibit, The Power of Protest, is sponsored by Ed and Peggy Robin. It's a story of the Soviet Jewry movement, that the political movement here in America and across the world that militated to rescue Jews from the Soviet Union. Really, the first sort of real uprising of American Jewish political power. And the exertion of American Jewish political power by the Jewish community to do an important thing to rescue a Jewish community from around the world. It's a wonderful exhibit. We're going to have a couple of evenings where we bring some of the people that are actually portrayed in the exhibit to come and speak with us and help us remember some of those days. Some of you may have been involved in that. If you remember the demonstrations and the sit-ins and the bracelets we used to wear and all that sort of thing, and it was quite remarkable. So enjoy this exhibit. It's really very remarkable. And what's been fun is that the kids come by, even the teenagers. So yesterday I had my class of teenagers, and these kids are all 16, 17 years old. They know nothing about this. Some of them are even Russian kids. They're children and grandchildren of those who were liberated and didn't even know this was their history. So it's been quite a wonderful thing to explain to them what the story is. So please come and take a look at this exhibit. And just to announce, in case I forget to do it again, so tonight is our last night for the semester. We're going to take a break for a couple of weeks, and we're going to reconvene on January the 8th and continue our conversation about the great Jewish debates. And I'll be teaching on January 8th about the issues that motivated, that split medieval and modern Jewry. Let's begin with welcome Rabbi Schwartzberg once again. First of all, I think your mother should be proud, because whether you preach as Jude, you preach Christianity, but you did something very. I want to point this out because it's really important. No, so we'll switch in a minute. I'll turn that one on.
I have a pretty loud.
No, it needs to be on because you're on. It's an international webcast. Here, hand me the mic. I'll take care of it. Here, no, that's not it. That's not it. So I want to compliment you. I'll tell you why. Because typically when we teach this kind of religious stuff, comparative religions, we sometimes get into the trap of playing competitive religion, and we compare the best of our own tradition to the worst of another tradition. And I thought that you presented the Christian tradition with great respect tonight, helping us understand where it came from and then how it developed and some of its principal ideas. And I want to go back to some of those ideas. But before we go back to those ideas, I actually want to go back to your own autobiography. Because it's kind of amazing. I mean, the story that you told us about, you studied in yeshiva, you went to Yeshiva University, you received your degree and your smicha from YU. It was a serious commitment. And then you went to Harvard Divinity School, where you were the only student in the school with a kippah. I'm tempted to ask you, what did you learn? But the most important question is, what did you gain? What did you learn about your own Judaism from that experience in a non-Jewish academic environment, in an assertively Christian academic environment?
That's a great question, one that I've thought about a lot internally, but I don't know that I've spoken about it before. I appreciate it. Okay, off the bat, two different things. I think I learned and developed a thickness to my Jewish identity that I never had before. I spent a lot of time vertically developing my Jewish identity, just immersing myself in Jewish text and developing a lot of skills, how to read the Talmud, how to read Midrash in its original text, how to break down a Talmudic piece, and learn a lot about halacha and knowing the law. But that identity wasn't that thick. I realized it wasn't horizontally developed. And immediately I got exposed to things like biblical criticism. I went to a place where the documentary hypothesis was a given. Like, you couldn't speak about the Torah as if it was written by God. You had to think about the Torah as if it was written by these people named P and E and J. And I had to like fake it till I made it, and to spend time at night reading about this because I don't know, Julius Wellshausen, who the hell is he? And I immediately I was shocked. Like, what is this? What is this place? Was it right that some of my rabbis at Yeshiva University said, "Are you sure you want to go to this? Are you sure you want to go to this place?" But I was also really privileged to have two professors who were in various degrees observant Jews. I remember being so amazed. My professor, John Levinson, you know John Levinson? Yeah. One of the really like gedolim of Bible studies today. And he, like an absent-minded professor, he would wear tzitzit. And he would walk around the campus with a little bit of a trail of his tzitzit, his fringes, hanging out of his shirt like an absent-minded professor would do. But he didn't wear a yarmulke. He didn't wear a kippah. And I was so fascinated by that because where I grew up, people, some people wore tzitzit, and some people didn't, but everyone kind of wore a yarmulke. And he was doing that, and I was around these people who had I went from a place where there were Rosh Yeshiva, who were masters of Talmud and Jewish law, and I went to a new place who were these people who were just as intelligent and were committed in their own way, but were Rosh Yeshiva, were masters of Jewish ideas through a different lens, through a different engagement with Jewish text. And it was just an amazing experience to have someone like Rabbi Michael Rosenzweig, who was my teacher at Yeshiva University, who I found to be one of the most brilliant people that I ever engaged and could kind of do incredible things to a piece of Talmud. And then I went 2 years later to a person like John Levinson, and I saw a different type of genius and people that had such different orientations to kind of the sanctity and the divinity of these canonized Jewish texts. And I was able to struggle, I called it like academic kollel, of thinking, what does it mean to be exposed to this type of person, and what does it mean to be exposed to this type of person, both of whom felt so committed to Judaism and Jewish learning, but came at it from two very, very different places. And it's a struggle that I had, and I remember kind of conversations with other colleagues where they're just like, you know what, you need to go to that burger joint down the road, and you just got to do it. You got to eat that burger for the first time in your life, because I was really struggling with these issues of faith. Mm-hmm. And I was really challenging the way in which I had grown up for so many years. And it's very important. I didn't grow up in an ultra-Orthodox community. I grew up in a mono-Orthodox community that's no different than Young Israel, a Century City, in the city or something like that. But I remember really going through those conversations, both internally and having conversations with some of my colleagues, other Jewish colleagues, and even some of the professors and other people that were not Jewish. And it built a lot of resilience and understanding for me, because it made me not only learn more, but I had to really think about, hey, why am I committed to this? Why is law a part of my life? And I think it did. It had an effect on me. It definitely expanded my own interpretation of law, my own comfort or my own rigidity when it came to law. It definitely had an impact. I think at that time, that's the reason why I found a place like Shalhevet, a place that was very committed to learning Torah and wanted to be centered around the modern Orthodox community, but also a place that believes strongly and still believes very strongly in a broader Jewish identity and wants to have a mixed population of Jews. So it challenged me. It built resilience. It forced me to think a lot. And honestly, till this day, I still can struggle with some of those questions. I haven't resolved all of them. But I'll end with one comment that I was considering, or I wanted to toy with the idea of what would it mean like to pursue and get a doctorate in some of this material. And Professor Shaya Cohn is one of the great Talmudists, who's a professor there, and he davens at an Orthodox shul. He said to me, the best person for a Jewish studies PhD is a wayward yeshiva bacher. So he says, I know you were a little bit of a yeshiva bacher. I'm not sure if you're wayward enough. So I said, what? I'm wayward enough? I wanted to be at that time. I don't know if I'm wayward enough. And the ability that I found to be able to enter back into the community that I'm a part of, and where I think that there are some people who have these experiences and some that don't, I've actually felt that in any community, like any community, the Orthodox community, as people asking all these types of questions, we're exposed to so much today on the internet or wherever it might be. People are really well educated. And I like that I can be the person that is able to talk about Christianity. I can be the person that can talk a little bit about biblical criticism, and I can be the type of educator, which I think is really critical, especially in my community, that's able to respond as best as I can to some of those questions. So I really wear it as a feather in my cap. Sometimes I get comments like, the one that I facetiously said, but it's real, about my mother, and some other people, where they'll see like me printing out this source sheet and be like, oh, of course that's you printing out that source sheet. But right. I'm really proud of it. I think it's critical. I think the sustainability of our community, or the way that we want our community to continue to develop, is in a community that can respond thickly and strongly and courageously to these questions without having to kind of hide or run away from them.
I really want to ask you about Christianity, but
yeah.
As long as I got you here, I mean, and we've been waiting to talk. So I want to ask you one more question about that very last comment. So you're the Dean of Students of Shalhevet. Everybody know where Shalhevet? Shalhevet is a modern Orthodox Jewish high school. It's on Fairfax. Beautiful building, by the way. I want you to help us understand how you teach, what your message is to your students. You're dealing with a population of kids. These are not kids who are living in the isolated ultra-Orthodox community.
Yeah.
They're not those kids. These are kids who listen to music the way our kids listen to music. They watch TV. They have 24-hour access to what's on the internet. So they're kids who really live in the modern world completely. And I imagine they hang out at the mall like all other kids, and they're subject to all of the temptations and forces that influence the attitudes of American teenagers. But they're in an Orthodox day school, and you're their teacher of spirituality. What's your message to them? In a word.
Well, firstly, maybe like the kids at, I'm not going to do that before recording this. Our kids don't engage in any of that behavior. Yeah, I would say when I first came out of divinity school and learning this, I got so excited. I'm like, yeah, I feel like this is what I was missing my whole life, and wanted to really teach and expose them to all of this. And I felt like this was so important. This is what I was missing in my education. And the truth is, I've had a real shift in the way I think about this, and I've probably become a little bit more conservative about this exposure. And I think with teenagers, this is where I am. It feels like I'm getting a little bit older in this shift. I was much more, I was probably more open and excited about exposure when I first started working at Shalhevet. I was excited that I was working at a place that wouldn't push back on some of these things, because you went to a place like where I went to high school or other modern Orthodox high schools, and they wouldn't be engaging in those conversations, and I was excited about it. And now we still naturally have some of them at the school, but I've actually become a little bit more like the Sifra that we read, where I think it's a really important message for teenagers because they're so exposed, and I'm not looking to make them less exposed. I think that's a losing battle. But I want my spiritual message, or a big part of my spiritual message to the students, is about submission to divine authority, and about recognizing that part of being a Jew is that it's not entirely in autonomous culture, and that part of being a Jew and part of being connected to a community is that you don't always get to make a decision that you're happy about or that you want. And part of our tradition is the tradition of our people, and halachic observance, somewhat whatever way your family does it, but to be observant. And I, as I get older, I do personally connect, not entirely and not always, to that message that the rabbis are saying about servitude and about being an Eved Hashem, only because I think the pendulum today is so much in a different direction that it's important that we instill as a spiritual message to our students that religion is still something that is theocentric. It is something that God is at the center, and it doesn't mean that our voice and our interpretation is not part of it. Of course it is. But letting especially young people know that there's, like, the parents say, when you're under my roof, you're going to follow my rules. Mm-hmm. And that's an important message, one that no kid likes to hear, but we all know as parents that that's a really important message for kids to hear at times and to understand that. So I think that as an educator, I have shifted a little bit. I still think I'm a very open person, but I've shifted a little bit, recognizing that I think that is a really important message that we can't stray away from in speaking to our students, that there's a theocentricity to Judaism, the Torah and halakha. Again, I'm very comfortable with different interpretations of halakha, but that these things are not always up for discussion. And that's a shift that I've had since I started as a teacher at kind of 27, 28, and now several years later, which I've seen that I think my job is to push back in a different direction. And that has very little to do with this experience, but I think in a sense it gives me the authority to say that message because I have had a little bit more exposure. I have been open, so I have the kind of credibility to now push back and offer that message.
Right. So let's return then to the conversation. And what I'd like to do is ask you a question or two about each of the stages we just talked about. So let's begin with the first one.
I really, really appreciated that summary.
No, it was you. I just
No, but that was
summarized it.
really, really helpful.
Thank
That was
you.
really helpful.
So in the first stage, you presented us with Matthew's Jesus. Whether that's really Jesus or not is irrelevant.
Yeah.
It's Matthew's Jesus. And Matthew's Jesus fits comfortably, as it were, in the milieu of a conversation over the truth of Torah. But what I want to clarify with you now is, so if we can talk, we know what the rabbis' positions were about some of these things. Let's talk about, if we can use this phrase, when a rabbi interprets Torah and you see a pattern in their interpretation, we'll call it his shita, his method, right? So Rabbi Akiba has a shita, is a method of how Rabbi Akiba likes to teach the Torah. And there's a method to Hillel, and there's a method to any one of the great rabbis. Let's talk about Jesus' shita, if we could, if lahavdil, okay? So you have the Sermon on the Mount, and he says to them, you've heard it said you will not murder. But I tell you that if you get angry at your neighbor, it's like you killed him. And then he says, you've heard it said you shouldn't commit adultery. But I tell you, if you look at a woman lustfully, you've committed adultery. And then you have this thing here where you say, you've heard it said you're allowed to give a woman a divorce. But a divorce is the same as adultery. How would you characterize Jesus' shita, his method, when it comes to Torah? What's the sort of deep inner principle of his Torah? And how does that differ from the way the rabbis did it?
So I think that's a great question and a really important one. And I think there's an easy answer to it. There's a Talmudic passage in Tractate Makot, Masechet Makot, where the rabbis try to figure out, so if we can kind of get all of Torah under one banner, what would it be? And there's a kind of a passage where they figure out, what is the shita of the Torah? What is the approach of the Torah? We take all this together and figure out what it is. And they end up kind of going back to a line from Habakkuk. I don't know it by heart, but it actually is something along the lines of it's about faith and belief. And I think if you were to ask Jesus and you said, what is this all about? What's the key principle that opens up the entire Torah? I think it's obvious. And that's one that I think we care a lot about, and that's v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. His approach. You will love your neighbor. You will love thy neighbor as thyself. And the principle that opens up the legal interpretation of Jesus is those social principles that are articulated in the Torah. Now, I'm not a scholar enough in all the examples to know whether that works across the board, but in the ones that you just articulated, the ones that I offer tonight, I think it's actually very clear. Yeah. And I think that whereas the Pharisees have this oral tradition that is generally followed within the rabbis of this kind of extreme attachment to the legal, and I use minutia not in a pejorative sense, but the legal details of the Torah and opening that up and thinking about what that means, Jesus sees the whole point of the Torah as one that creates this social community. And therefore, he and his followers become obsessed with, as I said, the line from the prophets, where they become obsessed with the obsession in the temple, because that becomes at the expense of creating a social community where everyone is, whether you want to call it equal, everyone is treated properly. And therefore, he interprets these passages in the Torah through that lens and through that prism. And it's not that Paul is not mistaken. What he ends up saying about the law, I think he's following, in some ways, this kind of legal tradition or the spirit of Jesus' legal tradition when he's talking about in more derogatory terms about the law, because he sees that what it's all about is really something like v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, these kinds of social or ethical principles of the Torah.
There's a section at the end of the book of Matthew, I think it's in 23, which always fascinates. It says Jesus gives this parable about a guy who has a pot. He says, and the Pharisees polish the outside of the pot, but you'll never get the pot clean until you clean the inside of the pot. And I always thought that was an interesting parable, because it seems to me that what you have here is two different strategies about how you change people, right? I can change your attitudes, and from your new attitudes, you'll change your behavior. Or I can change your behavior, and from your new behaviors, you'll change your attitude. So in a certain sense, the goal is the same, to create loving people. But the question is, do I get you to be a loving person by teaching you to curb your desires? Or do I teach you to be a loving person by teaching you to say no to certain temptations that are physically and materially present in your life?
I'm sure both work. I'll give our tradition a little bit maybe more of defense than I offered previously.
Yeah, good, because your mother's watching.
Right,
and
exactly.
She's wondering when you're going to say something good about Torah, you know.
Right.
So.
I think, and look, this is what I was saying, I was trying to say previously about an educational approach, that I think all of us, we want to, I certainly see this with younger people, is like, no, why do I need to do this? I'll just get to the part that like really, that really matters. And I think we usually, when we try to skip steps and when we try to take shortcuts, it oftentimes doesn't work out. There's, of course, exceptions to all of these, but I've always been a big fan of a basic kind of truism that I think finds itself in this early medieval text, the Sefer HaChinuch, which writes about some of Jewish laws, mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma. When you do something initially that's not for the right intentions, you do it enough times, and it actually leads you to finding intention, finding a connection to it. So every day I put on tefillin. I don't feel that connected to the leather straps that are around me. Davening and saying the words, that's really important. But as I've gotten older, the idea of tefillin, the idea of wrapping myself in something, and then of course wearing a talit, that puts me in a completely different state of mind. I mean, it doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes I'm, of course, distracted. But the idea of putting on tefillin for me, or wearing a talit, creates something that wouldn't exist for me if I wasn't wearing those clothing, or at least for doing it all this time. When I do daven, and if I don't have a talit with me, let's say, that is the way I think about tefillah. So it might be nice to just say the spirit of the law is all that matters, but I really don't believe that if we have Shabbat without some form of law, then we really have Shabbat. At least that's my experience. I think you could say, let it just be a rest day. But if I don't have some kind of guidance, some boundary for this experience, so it could be fine. Someone says to themselves, this week I'm not going to have Shabbat. But if you want to have Shabbat, there needs to be a boundary. We can't just skip the step and say, I'm going to have this day and have this sabbatical experience without creating those laws. So I always think about law. Law is a baseline. Law is not the ceiling, it's the floor. But by having that law and committing ourselves to that law, we help ourselves create that experience. We can create a little bit of a cocoon or boundaries that now says to me, here's what it's going to be about. Here's what I can do with it. Every particular of kosher is not that critical. But by having a way of eating in my life, that tells me that eating is something that is sacred. Eating is something that I can't take for granted. If I go on a trip with my family, I need to think about how we're going to eat. And that elevates the experience of eating for me. It makes it really difficult sometimes as well. But it brings kedusha, it brings sanctity to that experience. And that sometimes I think like the average or people can get lost in the details of the law. And I think you need to engage with the details of the law first and experience them and give them a shot, because when you immerse yourself in them and you experience them, they can actually create this really profound experience. Not always and not every day, but it can create that type of identity that leads to the sanctity, that leads to that spirit in a way that is, at least for me, or I try for that to be the case with me, for that to be a deeply sacred, a deeply meaningful, a deeply profound experience. And even when it's not, I can try to recognize, or I think it's important to recognize, as the rabbis were saying, that, hey, this is what it means to be a human being. A human being means you are actually living beneath a higher power. You're living beneath God. And it reminds me of that relationship. And I'm not convinced that the other approach will get you there.
So if we move to the second stage of what you set out for us, you have this fellow Paul. His real name was Saul, Jewish guy. He's working for the Roman government, persecuting Christians. Was his job. And he has this moment of revelation where Jesus appears to him, and he becomes the great apostle, the great missionary for the Christian message. And Paul goes a step further. Paul is no longer interested, as Jesus was in Matthew, to interpret the law. Paul goes to war against law. Paul has this idea that there's this perversity within human beings, that if I tell you don't do it, all you do is focus and obsess on doing it. And so that the law, Torah, becomes a trap. Yeah. It becomes a trap. It becomes a distraction. It becomes an obstacle to faith. It becomes a trap. And that for Paul, what Jesus said is largely irrelevant because he never quotes Jesus. Jesus' arrival to liberate us from law and allow us to relate to God without law, that really is the separation. That's the separation between the two faiths. So the difference is a question of your attitude to law and Paul's attitude to law. My teacher, David Hartman, once gave a very famous lecture at a Christian seminary. He said, you all teach Paul, but I want to tell you that there's no greater joy in my life than the joy of a mitzvah. So take a moment and talk about that. You just talk about something about the power of the mitzvah to create a moment. What's this joy of mitzvah that Paul is missing? What's the importance of mitzvah, the importance of commandment, of obligation, of chiyuv, of the claim of law on me that Paul just doesn't seem to get? If you could speak to Paul, if he showed up in a room, why he'd show up in a shul, I have no idea. But let's assume he would. And you could say to him, brother, you're missing something. Here's what you're missing. What would you say to him?
I think I would say what Rabbi Shalhevet said to your teacher, Hartman.
Yeah.
Rabbi Hartman. Okay.
Stump the rabbi.
No, it's a
No.
because I don't think that's entirely.
Go ahead.
I don't think that's entirely fair that Paul was missing the joy of mitzvah. I think that Paul thought there was a real trap in the emphasis on mitzvah. And I don't think, and this is what I alluded to before, that Paul even thought that Jews should not do mitzvot. I mean, we can address that question. I'm just not exactly sure that Paul would need to be convinced about the joy of mitzvah. Or you think that he just abandoned the idea of mitzvah? We can talk about that anyway.
I want to rephrase the question.
Yeah.
Let me rephrase the question. I'll make it easier for you.
Yeah.
You teach in a high school.
Yeah.
So a kid sees you after class and says, Rabbi Schwartzberg, I'm ready to give up this Jewish stuff because I just don't see the value in it. I just see the point of my life is to love and care for other people, to do justice in the world, to be a charitable soul. The kashrus, the shatnes, the Shabbos, the law, the rules. My God, you are so obsessed with rules, Rabbi. Why don't you just let go of all the goddamn rules and just try to love each other? Don't you think that would make for a better world, Rabbi? I don't imagine any teenagers ever said that to you. What do you say to that teenager?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult question. I don't think there's an easy answer. I'll try to tell you what I would say to that. And it's a question that I have to think about for myself all the time, especially that I think once a person is really committed to the law, in a sense, the law, in a sense, becomes a little less important. So you kind of get insight into the law, right, and you behave a certain way. You kind of get it. And the language that Paul uses about law, I skipped over the piece, but that law, but I alluded to it, he says law is a pedagogue. Law is something that gets you somewhere. Right. But that's not the end. That's not the end. That's not the end game. Look, I think that, and I would, and you'd be able to think about this how it works in your community. I think that law and mitzvot are extremely necessary as glue that binds our community together. And without that glue, I'm very, very, very concerned about what happens to the Jewish people. I'm a Maimonidean in thinking that the goal of Judaism is not to observe law, the goal of Judaism is to know God. And I believe that keeping law, and this is connected to the last answer, is that by observing law and being part of that, it helps you get to that place. Would I say to my students at Shalhevet that you can know God without observing law? I don't know if I would say that at Shalhevet. They're high schoolers. It's hard for them to fully understand that. But I would say to this crowd is that I think the goal of Judaism is to know and understand God. But in order to do that, you have to be invested in something. You want to get to know another person really, really well, you have to know them inside and outside. So I want to understand how a person is going to really know Judaism and know God without really investing and immersing themselves in Judaism, in the religion. Do I think that the only way to do that is to be a fully observant Jew? I don't think so. I think it's a really good path. And I think there's diversity of halachic interpretation and halachic practice. I'm fully comfortable being a pluralist in that sense. But you have to invest yourself in the guts of Judaism in order to know God. And to just say, I'm going to just love one another, I don't think that leads to relationship. I don't think that leads to creating the community that we want. I think it's important for the world to have really good Christian communities, and it's really important for us and the world to have really strong, tight-knit Jewish communities. I do not think the goal of Judaism is to teach our students or teach our kids how to have good values and love each other, and then stop being Jewish and stop caring about Jewish community. I think that becomes very diffuse. I think the world is best when every community is doing their best thing in their best way. The good communities, the people that are grounded in values and good ideas. So to me, you will not always find joy in keeping kosher. You won't always find joy in davening and being engaged in tefillah and prayer every day. But one of the things that I like to say is that in order for me to have a really good Sabbath, a good Shabbat, I need to keep Shabbat every week, because if not, I won't have those 10 ones during the year that change who I am as a human being. We need to have, I'm sorry if I sound like, boring, but we got to have some practice. And this is very in vogue today in the world. We need to have practice in our life in order for that to open up joy in our lives. And every single day won't be joyful on its own, or it may not be. But the idea of being involved in a habit, in a routine, opens up the ability for us to be connected with it. If you're always an outsider to Judaism, you're going to feel like an outsider to Judaism. You're not going to feel connected. And I like to emphasize, if I speak to non-Orthodox communities where halachic practice might not be the most important thing, to me the most important thing is for us to be engaged in the study of Torah, for us to be involved in things like that. That's how you learn the language. That's how you become connected with something. That's how you are able to find the joy in something. For Rav Soloveitchik, who engaged, or Rabbi Hartman was his student and disagreed with him, Rabbi Soloveitchik, who's not a direct teacher of mine, but someone who's influenced me deeply, he was, what a lot of people like to say, the founder of modern Orthodoxy, one of the great teachers at Yeshiva University, an incredible Talmudist, but someone who was incredibly well-informed about philosophy and was able to write things outside of Jewish law. He felt deep, deep joy in submitting himself to God. He felt that that was a cathartic, redemptive experience where you were able to humble yourself in front of something that was more powerful, and that is where a person grows, and that is where a person feels joy, by saying that I can retreat, I have control over myself, and that is where a person finds incredible joy. I want to get there. It's an incredible, hardcore stance that you find joy in submitting yourself to someone else. Like, that to me is an incredible statement about a relationship that a husband and wife can have when a spouse asks you to do something and that's the last thing you want to do, but your love for that person demands that you sacrifice yourself in that moment, and that is where the love is. That's how Rav Soloveitchik describes the relationship between man and God, that we don't want to keep kosher, but in our relationship and love for God, we submit ourselves, and he finds joy in that. I don't know that I can reach that place all the time, and I'm a Hartman Jew for sure as well. So I think there's a lot of joy in community, a lot of joy in many things that are Jewish, but if we're going to have strong, thick Jewish communities, we have to be immersed in it in some way, and Jewish law is a really good way of doing that for me, and being involved in Jewish stuff is really about that. And I'm afraid that if we only get involved in loving people and doing acts of kindness, that we lose our Jewish identity. And if we lose our Jewish identity, it could be that we end up then losing some of the good things that we're doing by loving everyone. But I don't know the answer to that.
Hartman. This is one of the
I
places.
want you to answer that
No,
question.
it's one of the places where Hartman disagreed with his teacher.
Yeah.
So Rabbi Hartman was my teacher, and Rabbi Soloveitchik was his teacher, and God was Soloveitchik's teacher. Or Herman Cohen. So same as God.
I think I think students of Soloveitchik would say that Soloveitchik was God's teacher.
Well, yeah. Hartman went the other way around. Hartman said, look, what Hartman would have said was Paul is right in certain ways that the law places tremendous burdens on me, and sometimes I fail. I can even say often I fail. But the burden itself is a compliment, because God would not command me to do something I'm not able to do. And the commandments point to a state of being, an aspiration. They point to a way of that they show me that I can elevate myself. I can become that person. I can be a gentle person. I can be a loving person. I can be a compassionate person, even if I fail at it. And I'm disappointed when I fail at it. And I do tshuva when I fail at it and try again. But even if I fail at it, the very fact that I'm commanded means I can. And if I commanded, it means I can. It's the greatest compliment in the world. And the joy is that I can. Right? So in some ways, it's the opposite. It's not submission.
Right.
It's an aspiration. In the same sense that, your wife tells you to do something, and you may do it or may not do it, but the fact that she loves you and depends upon you, and you depend upon her, and you have this aspiration for a loving relationship, is a tremendous compliment. That there's somebody in the world who's like waiting up for you. That's a tremendous compliment. Yeah. That's what Hartman called the joy of the law. And that would be his answer to Paul.
Yeah. I've always found the Pauline critique of the law to be something that was not. I understand, does this need to be tithed? Does this make you impure? All those things, okay, I understand. But this notion that law is captivity, that law is something that is adolescent, that whole claim seems adolescent to me in its nature. Yeah. It's like this idea that we should live. If we would say like the American community shouldn't have law. Of course, we know that we need law in our lives. But this idea that just being completely free and being connected with God on its own, I don't know. It never had strong resonance. The claims that are attributed to Jesus about what goes in your body doesn't matter as much as what goes out of your body. I think that's something that we should contend with and think about that. But what Paul's comments always found like they're too scathing. It didn't feel like I wonder who the Jews that he knew, how they were practicing, or they spoke about their practice. What led him, or his own experience, what led him to such scathing remarks?
Yeah. It's a very good. What it sounds like to me. When I've taught this to, especially to kids, is a lot of the kids I'm teaching are learning how to drive. Mm-hmm. And you know how when you learn how to drive, you got to memorize that book from the DMV. Yeah. Right? That's law. But the point of law is not to memorize the book and to learn how fast you have to go on an unmarked highway. The point of driving is to get someplace. Yeah. And I think so your initial comment that says, what's the purpose of this? The purpose of this is to gain a sense of God in your life, to gain a sense of the sacred, to make yourself into a certain kind of person, and to create a certain kind of human community. I think that's a beautiful way to think about it.
Yeah, and we always, and I think you see the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is talking about 24 chapters on Shabbat law. And it's kind of crazy. So much of it doesn't seem relevant. But I think it's also a misread of the Mishnah. And I think some of our halachic codes, that's why I think Rambam is so interesting, because he roots all of his halachic, his legal work in this kind of broader frame of who we are supposed to be, this kind of aspirational claim of becoming a prophet, of someone who knows God. And the Mishnah, I'm not convinced, or I think certainly a way to look at it is that the Mishnah wasn't obsessing over all these laws because this is what they thought was most important. The Mishnah became a replacement for the temple. And this is what I love so much about the rabbis, is that with the loss of a space, of a sacred space, the Jewish people found their space in the study of Torah and the study of God's word. So yes, there was interest in observance and recognizing that we had to do something. But so much of the project of the rabbis were just engaging with the words of God in its own right. It's the study of Torah. I don't know that the rabbis were so obsessed in the way that kind of Paul makes it seem like they were about every single layperson or every person caring about this little piece of carrying on the Sabbath or this, you may not qualify as something that is carrying on the Sabbath. But it's a way in which they connected to God in the absence of a temple. And the way in which, and it's certainly an issue in my own community, the way in which we engage with this sometimes is only focusing on the end result and not realizing that the process of learning is a way of connecting with God. It is a spiritual endeavor on its own, but not reading it as this obsession of the law at the expense of the spirit of the law. And I think there's a misread of the project of the rabbis that also is a problem here.
I want to thank Rabbi Schwartzberg for sharing this evening with us. Thank you so very, very much.
With pleasure.
I want to wish all of you a very, very happy Hanukkah.
Hanukkah
A very
Sameach.
good week. Be very careful outside. It's freezing cold. It has dropped to a frigid 68 degrees outside. Please bundle up. Put on your coats, your mufflers, your hats, and stay warm. We'll see you in January, on January 8th, for the continuation of our conversation. Hag Hanukkah Sameach. Take good care. Thank you. That was great. That was just